December 23, 1996. An eerie silence reigned that day in a remote house near the small Irish village of Toormore. It was the day before Christmas Eve, and yet there was no festive calm over the coastal landscape of West Cork, but something else, something intangible but palpable. On that day, a neighbor reported a disturbing observation. The front door of the white country house belonging to a French producer was wide open. No one answered when they knocked. No lights, no music, no smoke coming from the chimney. Just the wind whistling through the trees. The police were called. When the officers arrived at the house, they had no idea that they were at the beginning of a story that would preoccupy Ireland for decades. The next morning, a woman's body was discovered on a dirt road just a few meters from the house. She was wearing a blue bathrobe, pajama pants, and heavy boots. Her face was barely recognizable. It later emerged that the woman was Sophie Toscan du Plantier, a 39-year-old documentary filmmaker from France. She had bought a holiday home in Ireland to write in peace and get away from the hustle and bustle of Paris. No one could explain why she had left the house in her pajama bottoms that night, or whether she had left of her own accord. Sophie had traveled alone. Her husband, Daniel Toscan du Plantier, a prominent French film producer, had stayed in Paris. Her neighbors described her as polite, reserved, and naturally elegant. The small community in Toormore, where everyone knew everyone else, was deeply shaken by the brutal violence of the crime. It was a murder unlike anything the town had ever seen before. The investigation began immediately, but it soon became clear that solving this crime would be anything but easy. There were no obvious signs of a break-in, no motive, no clear suspect. What they had was a crime scene in a remote area, a badly disfigured body, and many unanswered questions. What no one suspected was that the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier would become one of the most mysterious and controversial criminal cases in Irish history, and the truth would not be easy to find. The investigation into the Sophie Toscan du Plantier case began under the most difficult conditions. The weather was harsh, the crime scene was unprotected, and the first traces had possibly already been washed away by rain and wind. The West Cork police were dealing with an extraordinary crime, not only because of the brutality of the act, but also because of the international attention the case attracted. Sophie was no stranger. As the wife of a famous French film producer, her death immediately became a political issue, both in France and in Ireland. For the police, it was a gauntlet of circumstantial evidence, allegations, and a community that was suddenly the focus of international attention. A name emerged in the first few days: Ian Bailey, a British journalist who not only knew a striking amount about the crime, but also made contradictory statements. But Bailey was more than just a curious observer. He was one of the first on the scene, one of the first to speak to the press, and repeatedly emphasized how shocked he was. The Briton lived with his partner Jules Thomas near the crime scene, worked as a freelance journalist, and, as many later noted, was astonishingly quick to provide information. He reported on the murder for British and Irish newspapers, wrote articles, conducted interviews, and often spoke with a striking attention to detail that made the police suspicious. Bailey had no alibi witnesses for the night of the crime. He claimed to have spent the night at home, but his partner could not confirm his whereabouts during the critical hours. In addition, several neighbors reported that Bailey had scratches on his hands and arms in the days after the murder, allegedly from cutting down a Christmas tree. But the police doubted this version. Things became even more suspicious when Bailey began to contradict himself. At one point, he said he had seen the woman before, but later claimed he had never met the victim personally. Investigators began to watch Bailey more closely. They tapped his phone, searched his home, and questioned him several times. But they had a problem. There was no hard evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses who had seen him near the crime scene. Bailey repeatedly protested his innocence, but his behavior, his demeanor, and his sometimes arrogant manner made him the target of public suspicion. In the background, Sophie's family fought for answers. Her parents and husband were appalled by the slowness and indecisiveness of the Irish authorities. They demanded justice, and they demanded an indictment. But the authorities hesitated. There were not enough facts to press charges. There was too much suspicion for an acquittal. Meanwhile, Ian Bailey continued to live in West Cork, unmolested but under close surveillance. He was a free man, but known everywhere as a suspected murderer. And so the story began to change, from the brutal murder of a woman to a criminal case that would soon become a national trauma. While no official charges were brought against Ian Bailey in Ireland, pressure on the authorities grew in France. Sophie's family fought tirelessly to keep the case from being forgotten. For them, it was clear. Bailey was the perpetrator. Too many clues, too many strange statements, too many odd coincidences. In the years following the murder, a rift developed between the Irish and French judicial systems. Ireland insisted on the principle of presumption of innocence, and on the fact that there was no admissible evidence against Bailey. France, on the other hand, invoked its laws, which allowed suspects to be convicted in absentia if there was sufficient circumstantial evidence. And that is exactly what happened years later. But back to the late 1990s, Bailey was arrested twice by Irish police, in 1997 and 1998. Both times he was released after a short time. The public prosecutor's office refused to press charges due to lack of evidence. It was a slap in the face for Sophie's family. The Irish authorities justified their decision, while the media increasingly picked up on the case. Bailey, who continued to work as a journalist, was interviewed by many broadcasters, sometimes in a bizarre, self-deprecating manner, as if he were enjoying the attention. But not everyone in the community was on his side. Many neighbors kept their distance from him. Some testified under oath that Bailey had been violent toward his partner in the past. Others reported that he had repeatedly implied while drunk that he had killed someone. Bailey himself later claimed that these statements were sarcasm, a kind of dark humor. But in the context of the murder, they seemed more like disturbing confessions. Over the years, the case became a political issue. Irish media regularly reported on new developments, French newspapers called for justice, and relations between the two countries were tense. In 2001, France submitted an official extradition request for Ian Bailey. Ireland refused. There were no formal charges, and Irish law protected its citizens from extradition without valid grounds. Despite all the disappointments, Sophie's relatives did not give up. They organized memorial events, set up a foundation, and kept alive the memory of the woman whose life had been so brutally cut short. Sophie's son, Pierre-Louis, who was a teenager at the time, became a committed advocate for his mother, both figuratively and legally. In the meantime, Bailey remained a free man, but the shadows grew longer. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime shows took up the case. Bailey was repeatedly the focus of attention. Some saw him as the victim of a media witch hunt, others as a manipulative and intelligent perpetrator who exploited the weaknesses of the system. And then, almost 2 decades after the crime, something suddenly happened that brought the case back into the public eye, this time internationally. On May 27, 2019, the most significant legal step in the case to date was taken in Paris. Ian Bailey was indicted in absentia by a French criminal court. Based on the available files and witness statements, the French judiciary had decided to proceed with the trial even without the physical presence of the defendant, a legally permissible option in France if extradition cannot be enforced. The trial lasted several days. More than 20 witnesses were heard, including former friends, neighbors, police officers, investigators, and members of Sophie's family. The evidence remained circumstantial, but the testimony painted a consistent picture of a man with violent tendencies, contradictory statements, and a disturbing proximity to the crime scene. On May 31, 2019, the Paris Assize Court announced its verdict. Ian Bailey was found guilty of murdering Sophie Toscan Duplantier on December 23, 1996, in Tourmoor, West Cork. The sentence, 25 years in prison. But the verdict remained symbolic. Bailey remained in Ireland, and the Irish government again refused to extradite him, this time on the grounds that he had already been arrested twice in Ireland for the same crime, but had not been charged. Extradition would violate Irish law and the principle of double jeopardy. Bailey himself responded to the verdict with his usual mixture of defensiveness and provocation. In interviews, he called the trial a farce and a legal nightmare. He continued to deny any involvement in the murder and increasingly presented himself as the victim of a political and media campaign. In France, however, the verdict was seen as an important step. For Sophie's family, it was the first form of justice, even if the convicted man was not behind bars. Her son, Pierre-Louis, said in an interview, "The verdict cannot bring my mother back, but it shows that she has not been forgotten." The French government again called on Ireland to reconsider its position, but Dublin stuck to its line. The European arrest warrant against Bailey had no practical effect in this case. The case highlighted the limits of cross-border prosecution and the powerlessness of the judiciary when legal systems clash. For Bailey, the legal pressure was real, but hardly noticeable in his everyday life. He continued to live in West Cork, published poems, appeared occasionally on television, and seemed to enjoy the attention. For many observers, this was a grotesque twist. A convicted murderer who had never seen the inside of a prison cell, and yet had traumatized an entire country. Even after the French conviction, Ian Bailey remained free in Ireland. The years passed, but the case continued to haunt people, both in France and in Ireland. There were repeated reports of new investigations, inconsistencies in the investigation, and old witnesses coming forward with new statements. Documentaries began to pile up. Netflix and Sky released lavishly produced series about the murder, featuring interviews with Bailey himself in which he protested his innocence. But his public image had changed. Where once there had been a certain fascination, he was now increasingly seen as a symbol of a failed justice system, someone who had slipped through the cracks while a family had yet to see true justice. Sophie's son appeared repeatedly on television shows, gave lectures, and publicly advocated for justice reform. He was firmly convinced that Bailey was his mother's killer, and that it should never have come to this. The bitter reality was that no one had the power to hold the man who took his mother's life accountable. Over the years, Ian Bailey's life became more turbulent. He lost his partner, Jules Thomas, who had supported him through thick and thin for years. In 2020, they separated for good. Bailey was reported to the police several times for minor offenses, including drug possession and harassment. His mental state was considered increasingly unstable. There was also repeated discussion about possible mistakes made at the crime scene. Important evidence had not been secured. Potential witnesses had not been interviewed in time. And Bailey? The man who was one of the first on the scene never really disappeared from public interest, even though his guilt was never legally proven in Ireland. Over time, a grim picture emerged. A brutal murder in a peaceful place, a prime suspect who was never brought to justice, a family waiting for justice, and a legal system that functioned so differently in two countries that in the end, no one knew what was truth and what was tragedy. On January 8, 2023, it was announced that Ian Bailey was struggling with serious health problems. The local press reported heart failure and several hospital stays. He himself admitted in an interview that he only had a few years left to live. His voice was fragile, his demeanor wavering between defiance and resignation. "I am not a murderer," he said repeatedly. And yet he was the man who had been convicted in France for the murder of Sophie Toscan Duplantier. and who remained free in Ireland until his death. On January 21, 2024, Ian Bailey died of a heart attack at the age of 66. It happened on a park bench in the center of Bantry, not far from the coast that had been his home for so long. His death brought the case back into the headlines, and with it the questions that had never been answered. For Sophie's family, Ian Bailey's death was no consolation. There was no admission of guilt, no final truth, no apology. Pierre-Louis said in a television interview just days after Bailey's death, "Now that he's gone, we hope that the memory of my mother will not fade, that she is more than an unsolved criminal case." In fact, Sophie Toscan du Plantier had taken on a special role in the collective memory in the years after her death. She became a symbol for female victims of violence, for international judicial cooperation, for the powerlessness of families who seek answers and do not find them. In Ireland, too, there was now discussion about whether a belated legal review was still possible, whether, despite Bailey's death, certain investigative errors should be made public, but many had long since lost faith in ultimate justice. Today, a simple wooden cross stands where Sophie's body was found. Tourists hiking through the hills of West Cork often stop, read her name, and some lay flowers. The wind blows across the fields, just as it did on that night shortly before Christmas.